On the evening of September 27, 1994, the ferry MS Estonia prepared for departure in the port of Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. It was a Tuesday, calm, gray, and cool. Autumn had settled early over the Baltic Sea. The air carried the smell of salt, rust, and diesel. Winds were steady but not unusual. Rain drifted through the streets of the harbor area, light enough that most passengers didn't bother with umbrellas. The ferry was scheduled for its usual overnight journey from Tallinn to Stockholm, a route it had completed hundreds of times before. The ship, 155 meters long, had become a familiar presence in the region. It had once been called Viking Sally, then Silja Star, before being renamed Estonia. Now it sailed under the Estonian flag. The crew was mostly Estonian. The language on board was mixed: Estonian, Swedish, Finnish, Russian. The route served many kinds of travelers. There were 989 people on board that night, 803 passengers, 186 crew. Some were tourists, others were long-distance truck drivers. A group of Swedish high school students was returning home from an exchange trip. Business travelers sat in the lounges. Couples made their way toward the cabins, pulling wheeled suitcases behind them. A few families were spread out in shared rooms. Some people had booked tickets last minute. Others had made this crossing many times before. The ferry had 11 decks. The car deck was on the second level, filled with trucks, vans, and passenger cars. Above it were cabins, restaurants, and lounges. The seventh deck held the pub, a disco, and a conference room. The bridge was on the top deck, where the ship's officers worked through their checklists, finalizing preparations for departure. In the early evening hours, boarding proceeded normally. The sky began to darken. Lights from the terminal reflected in small pools on the pavement. Crew members greeted passengers in neutral tones. Tickets were scanned. Cabin keys were handed out. Some passengers took the elevator. Others climbed the metal stairs. There was the usual clatter of luggage and quiet hallway conversations. A few people went straight to the cafe for a meal. Others dropped their bags and wandered the decks. Departure was scheduled for 1900 hours local time. Just before that hour, the Estonia pulled slowly away from the quay. The engines produced a deep vibration, steady and low. The vessel turned into the channel. On board, the movement was barely noticeable. The rain continued, drifting softly against the windows. The city lights faded behind them. In the cabins, people unpacked lightly. Most knew they would be ashore by morning. Some removed their shoes and settled in early. Others returned to the upper decks for drinks or conversation. The atmosphere was relaxed, familiar. The ferry was not full, but it was active. There were no signs of concern. The Estonia was equipped with stabilizers and watertight compartments. It had passed all required inspections earlier that year. It was not new, but it was considered capable. The seas ahead were expected to be rough. Autumn crossings in the Baltic often were, but not beyond the ordinary. Weather reports described wind gusts of 15 to 20 meters per second, with waves around 4 meters high, growing through the night. Ferry service continued as scheduled. At 8:30 p.m., the ship cleared the Tallinn harbor completely and entered open water. The motion became more noticeable, a gentle sway, then a deeper roll. Some passengers felt it. Most continued with their evening plans. In the cafeteria, trays slid slightly on the tables, but meals were still being served. Children played on the floors. Elderly passengers sat near the windows, watching the sea rise in the dark. In the pub, music played softly beneath the sound of conversation. People laughed, drank beer, shared cigarettes, told stories. Some groups knew each other. Others had only just met. At 10 p.m., many passengers had returned to their cabins. Some read. Others prepared for sleep. The halls quieted. Footsteps echoed in the stairwells. The ship moved steadily westward, heading toward the Swedish coast. In the control room, the bridge crew monitored radar and navigation instruments. Wind speeds were increasing. Visibility was fair, but the swell had picked up. The bow began to rise and fall more noticeably. It wasn't unexpected. The Baltic could be unpredictable in autumn, but the ship was still on course. There was no change in plans. Most passengers did not speak about the weather. They were on a modern ship, in the middle of a common route, under the supervision of an experienced crew. The movement was there, but manageable. Some had taken motion sickness pills. Others ignored it. For many, this was routine. What few people knew was how the ship's design would behave in worsening sea conditions, and what small points of failure had already begun to matter. But at this hour, the feeling aboard was ordinary. The night was long ahead. The ferry continued west, and most of those on board were still awake, talking softly behind closed doors, watching the waves through round windows, or simply listening to the hum of engines and the sound of water hitting steel. By 11 p.m., the MS Estonia was deep into the open water of the Baltic. The lights of land had long disappeared. The sky above was clouded, with no visible stars. The sea below was growing rougher with each passing hour. Wind swept across the deck, rising in long, cold gusts. The waves had increased in size, lifting the ferry higher and dropping it more sharply. The motion became harder to ignore. Inside the ship, passengers began to adjust. Some returned to their cabins early, preferring to lie down. Others stayed in the lounges and seating areas, wrapped in coats or blankets. In the corridors, footsteps became slower and more deliberate. Drinks spilled more easily. On the upper decks, the wind howled through the gaps between doors and railings. Doors swung shut with louder sounds than usual. Chairs slid on their bases. The sea was not violent yet, but it was no longer gentle. On deck 7, the public spaces were still active. The pub remained open, though quieter than earlier. The disco had a few passengers dancing, but the floor moved beneath their feet in uneven shifts. In the cafeteria, only a few tables were occupied. Most meals had ended. Staff continued their duties, clearing plates, wiping tables, restocking supplies. A few conversations slowed. People began to look toward the windows more often. Crew members moved through the ship, checking on conditions. Some spoke briefly with passengers who asked about the movement of the ship. They reassured them. It was rough, yes, but the ferry had handled worse. This was not unusual for late September. Still, more people began to feel uneasy. Not afraid, just unsettled. In several cabins, drawers had begun to slide open on their own. Coat hangers shifted back and forth inside the closets. Some passengers put towels or clothing in place to keep items from moving. A few reported the sensation of the floor tilting beneath them, slowly, but in a way they hadn't felt before. The ship's design was built to handle sea conditions like these. Ferries crossing the Baltic were expected to encounter high waves and wind. Stabilizers were in place. The ship had compartments designed to remain sealed in case of flooding. But above the waterline, people noticed more movement than they were used to. Doors no longer closed with a click. They slammed. The ship creaked more than before. On the bridge, the crew monitored the sea state closely. Wind speeds had reached 20 to 25 meters per second, or around 45 to 55 miles per hour. The waves were now measuring between 4 and 6 meters, rolling high and uneven. The wind direction shifted slightly, pushing the waves in unpredictable patterns. The ferry continued forward, but with more resistance. Some of the crew made rounds below. In the lower decks, including the car deck, conditions were more difficult to monitor. The Estonia's bow visor, a large hinged structure that covered the front of the car ramp, was taking the full impact of the waves. Each time the bow rose over a swell, it came down hard. The sound could be heard in the cabins below. A few passengers on lower decks mentioned the noise. A deep, hollow thud. Repetitive. Mechanical. Not alarming at first, but noticeable. It felt like the ship was absorbing impacts directly through its structure. It wasn't enough to wake most people. But for those still moving about, the sound stood out. A dull knock, followed by silence. Then another knock. The auto deck, which held dozens of trucks and cars, was closed and sealed for the night. No one was permitted there during the journey. It was unlit. Watertight doors were locked. Still, the ferry's structure carried sound and vibration. Some passengers lying in lower bunks later described the feeling of pressure beneath them, as if something had shifted. Others described nothing unusual at all. The ship pressed forward. It had left the Estonian coast behind and was now midway across the Baltic Sea, heading toward the Swedish shoreline. No changes had been made to course or speed. No warnings had been issued. Communication between the crew and the passengers remained minimal. Conditions were monitored from the bridge. Reports continued as usual. It was around midnight when the movement of the ship became more difficult to ignore. In some cabins, passengers were knocked gently against their beds as the ship rolled more forcefully. The rhythm changed. Instead of smooth rises and falls, there were sharper drops. One motion would pass, followed by an unexpected jolt in another direction. Drinks left on shelves fell over. Some luggage shifted. A few people got up to check the hallways. Nothing was announced. No alarm was sounded, but conversations had stopped in many rooms. On Deck 7, the lounge was nearly empty. Crew members were less visible now. Some had been called to internal duty. Others were already in place. The ship's internal systems continued operating, lights, elevators, intercoms, but with occasional flickers and pauses. By 1 a.m., the ship continued forward, fighting against the rising sea. Most passengers were in their cabins by then. Some asleep, others trying to be. A few sat up in bed, listening to the hull, listening to sounds they didn't recognize, listening to the sea tap the side of the ship in stronger and stranger rhythms. And for now, there was no clear reason to worry. Only the sound of the sea, louder than it had been, and the shape of the night pressing gently, invisibly around them. The MS Estonia was a roll-on/roll-off ferry built in 1980 in a German shipyard. It had served under different names and flags before being purchased by Estline for the Tallinn-Stockholm route. Its design followed a pattern common to Baltic ferries at the time. A large open car deck low in the hull, fronted by a bow visor that opened upward to allow vehicles to drive directly onto the ship. The bow visor was large, a hinged steel structure mounted on the front of the ship, covering the ramp that led to the vehicle deck. When closed, it locked into place with a set of latching mechanisms. These were supposed to hold the visor shut against pressure from wind and waves during the voyage. The ramp itself was designed to form a watertight seal once the visor was in place. It was the only significant barrier between the sea and the open deck where vehicles were parked. The car deck spanned almost the full length and width of the ship. It had no internal watertight divisions. It was designed for efficiency, quick loading and unloading. But this also meant that if water ever entered, it would be able to move freely. The ship's designers were aware of this risk. In theory, the seals, latches, and doors would prevent that from happening. But design is one thing. Conditions are another. By 1 a.m. on September 28th, the Estonia had been facing rough seas for hours. Waves rose more than 4 meters high, and occasionally higher. The ship's bow met each wave with a force the passengers could feel, lifting upward, then slamming down into the next trough. Each impact reverberated through the structure. It wasn't unusual for this route, but it was sustained, and it was getting worse. Behind the bow visor, the ramp that protected the vehicle deck was absorbing more stress than usual. The latch systems were under continuous strain. They had been inspected earlier that year, but the Estonia had already experienced several hard crossings. Steel flexes under force. It fatigues over time. The pounding motion of the bow was not just a sensation for those sleeping inside the cabins. It was a mechanical pressure applied, wave after wave, against the front of the ship. Some of the sounds passengers described, deep knocks, hollow booms, metal creaking, were likely the result of those impacts. On the bridge, the crew had access to the ship's motion sensors and sea condition reports. They could see the vessel's pitch and roll, but they did not yet know that something was happening at the front of the ship. The bow visor was enclosed. No cameras were positioned to watch it. There were no sensors to monitor the visor's structural integrity in real time. Just behind the visor, several large trucks and cars were secured on the vehicle deck. The deck was quiet. The engines were shut off. The lights were off. The space, during nighttime crossings, remained sealed and unoccupied. Most of the vehicles were tied down with straps and blocks. But even secured cargo can shift under the force of repeated movement. And if the ramp seal were to fail, even slightly, water could begin to enter. Estonia did not have side doors on the vehicle deck for emergency drainage. If the ramp failed, there would be little time to react. A few centimeters of water inside the deck wouldn't sink the ship. But water moves. It sloshes. It creates free surface effect. An instability where the shifting mass of water inside a vessel worsens the roll, exaggerates the tilt, and creates a feedback loop. The ship, in effect, begins to fight against itself. No one in the passenger cabins knew this. No one on the bridge saw it happening. The sounds continued. A few passengers noticed. Some wrote later that they felt the ship move differently around this time. A longer pause between rolls. A deeper lean. One described it as slower to recover. Another recalled an uneasy vibration, followed by silence. Somewhere between 1 o'clock and 1:15 a.m., the bow visor began to loosen. The latches, under strain, began to fail. The visor flexed slightly with each wave. Then more. Eventually, it broke away from the hull. With the visor gone, the ramp behind it was exposed directly to the sea. It was not built for that. The next wave, or perhaps several, struck the ramp with full force. It collapsed inward, and with that, water had a way in. The first moments of flooding were not loud. The car deck was a large, open cavity. When seawater began rushing in, there were no barriers to stop it. The ship didn't sink instantly. It kept moving, but its center of gravity shifted. Each wave now added more weight. The list, the tilt, began gradually then increased. The crew did not see the visor detach, but they would soon feel what it meant. By the time water had fully entered the car deck, it was already too late to close anything. The ship had been breached, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a silent mechanical failure, the kind that happens not all at once, but in layers. A system under pressure, a latch giving way, a door no longer holding. The movement of the sea had found its way in. And now, inside the ferry, things were about to change. It was just after 1 a.m. when the change became noticeable. Most passengers were asleep. Some had been resting since earlier in the evening. Others had gone to bed later, after time in the lounges or upper deck cafe. The ship was dark inside. Corridor lights were dimmed. Cabin windows showed only blackness. Outside, the storm had continued building. Then the motion of the ship changed. Passengers described it differently. Some said it felt like a jolt. Others called it a roll, not unusual for a ferry, but deeper than expected. A few felt a dull thud, followed by silence. For many, the sensation was enough to wake them. It wasn't sharp, but it was different. The rhythm had changed. The ship no longer rose and fell in the same predictable pattern. In a few cabins, drawers slid open on their own. Bottles tipped. Shoes rolled across the floor. Passengers sat up, trying to understand what had caused the shift. In some rooms, voices stayed quiet. In others, people stood and opened their doors. Some looked into the hallway and saw nothing unusual. Just other passengers also unsure. The Estonia was beginning to list, a slow lean to starboard, the right-hand side of the ship. At first, the tilt was minimal, less than 5 degrees. It was easy to mistake it for normal movement, but it didn't correct. It stayed, and with each passing minute, it grew. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the entire ship began to tilt farther. Crew members received calls. In the lower sections of the ship, reports of water had begun to come in. Not in the cabins, not yet, but lower, near storage spaces and machinery. Something wasn't holding. A few crew moved quickly toward those areas. Others were told to remain at stations. No general alarm had been activated. There was no announcement, no signal to the passengers. In the corridors, more people began to emerge. Some held onto the walls as they walked. Others remained inside, watching how their belongings slid across the floor. The lean was no longer subtle. At 1:15 a.m., the ship was listing beyond 15 degrees. Walking became difficult. On the upper decks, chairs began to shift. Glasses fell from tables. In the stairwells, the handrails now felt like essential supports. Still, most passengers did not know what was happening. There had been no loud sound, no explosion, no warning, just the movement, now slower, heavier off balance. Some thought the ship might be turning. Others believed it was part of the storm. But many sensed that something was wrong. The movement no longer felt like rolling over waves. It felt like something had changed inside the ship. In a few cabins, passengers began pulling on jackets and shoes. Others waited, unsure. There had still been no announcement. On the bridge, the crew now understood that the ship was in trouble. The list had become dangerous. Water was inside. The engines were struggling. Systems were failing. The Estonia was losing power. Some alarms were activated, internal ones, but the ship's communication system was already beginning to falter. Electrical interruptions, loss of pressure, and confusion about the scale of the damage slowed the response. The ship was listing past 20 degrees. At this angle, doors no longer closed properly. Some stairwells were no longer usable. In the cabins, people struggled to stand. Luggage blocked exits. Bathrooms flooded. The floor no longer felt horizontal. Passengers moved with effort, climbing up what had once been flat ground. By 1:20 a.m., water had reached higher levels. Some passengers began to hear it, not just as impact against the hull, but as movement inside the ship. A sloshing, rhythmic, unnatural sound. Cold air moved through the corridors. Metal creaked under pressure. Some lights flickered. Others failed completely. In the hallways, people began moving upward. Those closer to the top decks had more space. Some reached the outer doors and entered the wind and rain. Others were still trapped below, unsure how to get out. The staircases were steep now. Every movement uphill required effort. Those who had fallen behind were slower to react. Some had not woken up at all. Inside the ship, confusion replaced routine. No one knew the full picture. No one understood yet that the ship was sinking. But the signs were everywhere. In the walls that no longer stood straight, in the doors that no longer opened fully, in the way people began to look not for help, but for direction. And all around them, the list continued to grow. In the minutes after the Estonia began to list, there was no coordinated signal to alert the people on board. No siren, no general evacuation order, no loudspeaker instructions. There was only the tilt and the growing sense that something was very wrong. By 1:20 a.m., the list was already past 20 degrees. In practical terms, this meant that walking was no longer just difficult. It was near impossible without support. Floors had become slopes. Furniture slid. In some cabins, mattresses pressed against the walls. Toiletries spilled into hallways. Doors that had been easy to open only moments earlier were now jammed shut. Passengers trying to escape their rooms struggled with locks, weight, and gravity. Some moved upward through the stairwells. Others tried but slipped or turned back or became stuck behind other passengers. There were no guides, no crew members stationed at intersections. The crew itself had been affected, scattered, called to duty, or trying to help passengers individually. In many places, people helped each other. In others, they simply stood still. Not everyone moved at once. There was still confusion, still disbelief. A few passengers thought the ferry was adjusting to the storm, that perhaps it had turned suddenly or shifted to correct course. Some hoped the tilt would stop, that it would level out, that this was temporary. Others knew better. They had seen water in the corridors. They had felt the cold air rushing through cracks. Some had heard noises behind the walls, rushing pressure, thudding metal. And some, already on the outer decks, could see the angle of the sea rising against the ship. The waterline was no longer where it should be. Inside, the power began to flicker. Some hallway lights failed completely. Others dimmed. Emergency lighting was inconsistent, brighter in some areas, barely visible in others. People moved by feel. They held onto railings, door handles, the clothing of others. A few shouted for help. Most stayed quiet. Voices echoed strangely through the tilted walls. In one section of the ship, a group of passengers sat together in the corridor, unsure whether to go up or wait. The climb looked too steep. The deck they were on felt stable enough for the moment. They stayed where they were, watching the hallway tilt further. On the outer decks, wind whipped across the open space. The rain had not stopped. Visibility was poor. Some passengers had made it outside wearing only socks. Others wore light jackets or nothing at all. The temperature was low, around 10 degrees Celsius and falling. The sea was rough. Large waves rocked the ship more violently now. It no longer moved like a vessel cutting through water. It moved like something out of balance. The ship's tilt passed 30 degrees. Water, now above the car deck, had reached upper levels. The free surface effect began to intensify. Each wave shifted the water trapped inside the ship. The list grew faster. What had been a lean was now a slope. For those inside, gravity was working against them. People could not reach doorways without crawling. Some became trapped in rooms, unable to pull doors open uphill. In one stairwell, passengers began to pile up, not in panic, but in weight. The stairway was nearly vertical now. People climbed over one another. Some lost grip and slid. Others reached back to pull others forward. No one was shouting orders. There was no centralized voice, only the instinct to go up. Outside, lifeboats were technically available, but only a few could be reached. Most were positioned on the high side of the listing ship, unreachable by normal means. The tilt was too steep. The ship's own angle had made its evacuation systems almost unusable. Inflatable rafts remained packed. The emergency lifeboats swung at uneven angles or jammed in place. Inside the bridge, the crew had sent a distress call. A mayday. The message was brief. Confused. It indicated that the ship was taking on water and losing stability. Other vessels in the Baltic Sea received the signal. Some altered course. Others tried to make contact. But it would take time. No nearby ship was close enough to reach Estonia immediately. By this time, the tilt was beyond 40 degrees. The list was critical. Inside the ship, most movements had stopped. Not because people had given up, but because they could not go further. Passengers lay pressed against walls. Some had crawled into stairwells. Others were crouched in corners, waiting, holding on to one another. In some cabins, doors had burst open under pressure, letting water in. The temperature dropped as seawater filled the lower decks. And still, in many parts of the ship, there had been no official announcement. Only the physical reality, cold air, dark hallways, and the shifting sensation of a ship that was no longer returning to balance. The Estonia had not gone silent, not entirely. There were still footsteps, still breath, still the occasional voice calling out. But above it all was the absence of direction. And below it, the weight of water moving in the wrong places. At 1:22 a.m., a distress call was sent from the bridge of the MS Estonia. The message was brief. The voice on the radio spoke in English, strained and unclear. Mayday, Mayday, Estonia. We have a serious problem. Then silence, then static. A second call followed, slightly more urgent. The position was given. The nature of the emergency, water ingress and heavy list, was stated but without full detail. The message was not received clearly by all who listened. On board, the ship was no longer holding itself upright. The list had reached more than 45 degrees. Some described it as climbing a hill just to reach the outer decks. Others were already outside, crawling on metal flooring slick with rain. Railings that had been waist height were now overhead. Windows that once faced the horizon now stared down at the sea. Inside, many were still trapped. Some passengers had made it to corridors, only to find the doors out jammed or blocked. Others were stopped by stairwells that had turned into vertical shafts. A few helped each other climb, locking hands, forming chains. In darkness, in silence, in the sounds of breathing and effort, they moved toward what they hoped would be air. The Estonia was now turning, not by navigation, but by physics. The weight of water inside the hull, the wind, and the angle of the list combined to shift the vessel. It rolled, leaning sharply to starboard. The ship had lost power minutes earlier. Lights flickered, then died. Generators failed. There was no longer control, only momentum. On the outer decks, several passengers reached the uppermost side, what had been the port side, now facing upward. From there, they could see the horizon. Black sky, darker sea. Wind cut across the deck in sudden gusts. Rain continued. There was no moon, no visible lights from land, only the deep, open water below and the slow tilt of the ferry beside them. Some jumped, not out of panic, but necessity. They reached the railing, found themselves standing nearly sideways, and made the decision. Others slipped. A few held on until the deck submerged. There were no lifeboats available on that side. The tilt had rendered them unusable. Rafts had not been fully deployed. Ropes tangled. Some fell away. Others remained locked in place. In the water, conditions were severe. The temperature was around 10 degrees Celsius, with wind chill far colder. The sea was not calm. Waves rose and fell between 4 and 7 meters. People who entered the water immediately felt the cold seize their bodies. Life jackets were scarce. Only some had managed to put them on. Others floated without support. Many had jumped without shoes, coats, or even socks. Time became different in the water. Minutes felt longer. The ferry was still above the surface, but sinking rapidly. From the water, survivors could see it tipping further, water reaching the upper decks. The silhouette of the Estonia, once bright and clean, had become a dark, slanted outline. A few still clung to railings. Others slipped below. Some shouted. Others said nothing at all. By 1:50 a.m., the Estonia disappeared from view. The exact moment was not seen by most. Those in the water were focused on survival. The ship did not go down in one instant. It submerged gradually, the stern rising briefly, then falling. No explosion, no sharp noise, only the loss of its shape into black water. Survivors in the sea now waited. Some found life rafts. A few had deployed and floated free. They were hard to reach. The waves pushed people away. Climbing in was difficult. The rafts were slippery, crowded, unstable. Some capsized. Others held just a few. Those who made it inside described a slow awareness of who had not followed. The first rescue helicopters had not yet arrived. Ships responding to the distress call were still hours away. Radio traffic increased. Coordinates were exchanged, but the Estonia was no longer transmitting. Search and rescue units began making their way toward the last known position, but the sea and wind made progress slow. In the water, most survivors drifted without direction. Some floated alone. Others clung to debris. Some closed their eyes and held still, trying to conserve energy. A few called out to others. Others stayed quiet. There were no lights, no markers, only the sound of waves, the cold, and the gradual dimming of physical strength. The rescue would come later. But by then, the difference between those still alive and those already lost would be measured in minutes. Not by bravery or age or experience, but by luck, location, and whether or not a life jacket had been secured in time. By sunrise, the ship was gone, and the people in the water, those who had survived the jump, the cold, and the dark, were scattered across the sea. The MS Estonia was gone. By 1:50 a.m., the ship had disappeared beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea. There had been no explosion, no visible fire, no breaking in two. It had simply tilted, filled, and gone under. Slowly at first, then more quickly, until the lights vanished, the decks submerged, and nothing was left above the water but drifting objects, empty rafts, and people. The wind was steady from the southwest. Waves continued at 4 to 6 meters high, with some higher crests. The sea was black, moving without pattern. Rain was still falling. No nearby vessels had arrived yet. The first search and rescue helicopters were still fueling, still receiving coordinates, still preparing to fly out into the dark. The Estonian distress call had been received, but it had not contained clear detail. At sea level, for the people who had survived the sinking, the water offered no timeline. Those who had managed to escape the ship, by luck, decision, or proximity, were now either in the water or on rafts. The water temperature was just under 10 degrees Celsius. For a human body in those conditions, survival time is measured in minutes. Muscles slow, breathing becomes shallow, coordination fades, shivering stops. Most people lose consciousness before hypothermia becomes fatal. The cold is not sharp, it's dull, heavy, and it settles into the bones without resistance. Some survivors were in inflatable life rafts. Only a few had deployed properly. Others had been released manually or floated out after the ferry submerged. The ones that remained upright became temporary shelters. Not warm, not comfortable, but sheltered, partially enclosed, with space for between 6 and 12 people. Most of the survivors who reached these rafts did so with great difficulty. The wind had scattered them quickly. Waves knocked people away as they tried to climb in. In the dark, survivors couldn't see how many others were nearby. Some heard voices, distant or muffled. A few called out, but many had no strength to respond. Those who had life jackets floated with their heads above water. Those without dipped beneath the surface with each wave. Some held onto debris, wooden panels, seat cushions, rails torn from the deck. But the sea was not still. Every item drifted apart over time. Inside one raft, a group of 6 people sat pressed together. They didn't know each other. 2 spoke Finnish. One was Estonian. The others didn't speak at all. One man had no shoes. Another had lost his coat. The raft rolled with the waves, its fabric walls rising and falling. Rain collected in the bottom. A few tried to bail water using their hands, but it kept returning. The wind came in from the top flap. No one moved much. They tried not to. Elsewhere, another raft capsized. Too many had tried to climb in at once. The sides gave way. People fell back into the water. 2 climbed in again. One remained hanging from the edge. Another drifted away, calling out briefly before disappearing. No one else was strong enough to reach him. The hours passed slowly. There was no indication of time. Watches had stopped. Phones were gone. Some people drifted in silence for more than 3 hours before seeing another vessel. Others saw nothing at all. Some rafts were spotted by merchant ships responding to the Estonia's mayday. Others were located by search helicopters from Sweden and Finland. But coordination was slow. The sea was wide, and the rafts were small. By the time searchlights swept across the water, many of the voices had already fallen silent. At one point, a Swedish rescue helicopter hovered over a partially collapsed raft. The pilot could see 2 survivors. The raft was half filled with water. One man inside was conscious. The other was not. A rescue swimmer was lowered into the sea. The man in the raft tried to help. His movements were slow, his coordination fading. The swimmer secured him first. The winch pulled them up one at a time. Each rescue took time. From helicopter to harness to stretcher, every step required care. Survivors were wet, cold, and often unable to assist in their own extraction. Some were unresponsive. Others panicked once in the air, their bodies reacting instinctively to the pressure and movement. Many were wrapped in thermal blankets immediately upon boarding. A few had to be revived midair. Some were too far gone. One raft, found after 5 a.m., held 4 people. 3 were conscious. One had died during the night. The others didn't speak about it. They had simply stayed close to each other, pressed against the wall, trying to share what little warmth remained. Their fingers were stiff, their faces pale. When the rescue team approached, one of them lifted a hand slowly. He was not sure if they had been seen. Another group was found by a merchant ship. The ship had altered course hours earlier and arrived in the search area near dawn. From the bridge, crew members scanned the surface with binoculars. One saw a shape. The captain changed course. As they approached, a lifeboat crew was launched. Inside the raft were 2 people, both alive, barely responsive. They were hoisted onto the deck in silence. One muttered a name. The other stared ahead without speaking. By sunrise, weather conditions remained difficult. Rescue teams had found several survivors, but many had already succumbed to the cold. Some were still in the water. Some had never reached a raft. A few more were found during the day, but the number was small. The search continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Eventually, it became clear that most who had entered the water had not survived. The final rescue count listed 137 people saved. Of those, only 1 was rescued directly from the water. The others had been found in rafts. The rest, more than 850 people, were unaccounted for. Some would be recovered later. Most would not. And of the ones who survived, many never remembered the exact moment the ship disappeared or how long they floated. Only that the sea was cold, that the night was long, and that the voices around them grew fewer with each passing hour. The first calls for help had reached land not long after the 1:22 a.m. distress message from the Estonia. Ships at sea heard the mayday. Coast guards in Finland, Sweden, and Estonia responded quickly, at least as quickly as the conditions would allow. But the Baltic Sea that night was unforgiving. Rescue helicopters had to be fueled, loaded, and given coordinates. Vessels at sea turned toward the last known location, but many were hours away. And the Estonia was already gone by the time they arrived. By 2 a.m., a handful of ships were already en route to the disaster zone. They followed the mayday signal, supported by radio contact and radar tracking. The weather remained poor. High winds, rain, heavy seas. The search area, though narrowed by the final coordinates, was still vast. Darkness made visibility almost impossible. The first visual confirmation came from a Swedish maritime patrol aircraft, which flew over the area just before 3 a.m. The crew saw debris in the water, broken pieces of deck furniture, life jackets, insulation cargo, scattered across the surface. The sea moved too violently to hold anything still. They also spotted a life raft. It was drifting, partly submerged, with no visible movement inside. The aircraft marked the location and relayed it to surface vessels. Soon after, more rafts were identified. Some were empty, others held people. Most of them were not moving. The first rescue helicopter, a Finnish Super Puma, reached the site around 4 a.m. Its crew was briefed, but did not yet know the full scope. As they lowered into the storm, searchlights revealed the shape of a life raft, then another. They circled, positioned above. One crew member was lowered into the sea. He swam to the raft, pulled open the flap, and saw 4 people inside. 2 were conscious. The other 2 were not. Extraction was slow. One by one, survivors were hoisted up. Each had to be wrapped, checked, stabilized. Some shivered violently. Others had stopped shivering. Once on board, they were covered in thermal blankets, given oxygen, and monitored by the onboard medic. There was no conversation, just breath, effort, and cold air. Nearby, other rafts were located. Each time the same pattern: approach, descend, assess, lift. The wind slowed progress. Waves continued to crash against the sides of the rafts. One capsized during recovery. A survivor fell into the sea. The swimmer went in after him, pulled him up, secured the harness. They rose together silently. Around the same time, merchant vessels began to arrive. The Silja Europa, one of the first large ferries on scene, spotted debris and deployed small rescue boats. The Mariella, another passenger ship, did the same. From the bridges of these vessels, crew members used spotlights and binoculars. Some ships had thermal imaging. Most did not. What they found was mostly silence. Rafts with few survivors. Many empty jackets. Floating debris. Still water where motion had once been. By 5 a.m., the scale of the disaster was becoming clearer. Survivors were few. Most were being pulled from rafts, not the sea. Those who had remained in open water had not lasted long. Hypothermia took them before rescue could arrive. The one man recovered alive from the sea that night was found by a helicopter crew after more than an hour of searching. He was barely conscious. His life jacket had kept him afloat. His body had gone rigid. He was lifted, treated, and survived. As daylight approached, the sky lightened in streaks of gray. Rain continued, but visibility improved. Aircraft flew in tighter formations. More helicopters joined. Swedish military units, Finnish rescue teams, and Estonian vessels coordinated as best they could. The Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Turku, Finland, directed operations from shore. But the work was slow. One raft at a time, one person at a time. Many were never found. The search area expanded, but most bodies had already slipped beneath the surface. Some had sunk with the ship. Others floated for hours before vanishing. The sea was too wide and too rough to search thoroughly. Debris was marked with buoys. Rafts were retrieved and counted. The name Estonia was written in logbooks, on charts, and repeated in calls over the radio. By mid-morning, the rescue was still ongoing, but the tone had changed. There were fewer rafts left to check. The rate of new discoveries slowed. Aircraft began returning to base for fuel. Ships drifted quietly across the search zone. The questions that remained were no longer about rescue, but about what had happened and how it had happened so fast. Of the 989 people aboard the MS Estonia, only 137 survived. The rest were missing. Some would be recovered in the coming days. Others would never be seen again. For the rescue teams, there were few words to say. The survivors they brought back, wrapped in blankets, trembling, unable to speak, carried the weight of what had happened. They had seen the ship lean and vanish. They had watched others disappear. They had waited for hours in silence, and now, even in safety, many could say very little. The rescue was over. The sea was still moving, and below its surface the Estonia remained, no longer visible, no longer intact, but present. The first official reports of the disaster reached the public just after sunrise on September 28, 1994. News bulletins interrupted regular broadcasts. In Tallinn, Stockholm, and Helsinki, local stations aired brief updates. A passenger ferry en route from Estonia to Sweden had issued a distress call. There had been a storm. Rescue operations were underway. At first, the scope wasn't clear. The name of the ship, MS Estonia, was confirmed by mid-morning. The number of people on board was estimated at over 950, including passengers and crew. A few survivors had already arrived in Finland by helicopter. No one yet knew how many more there would be. At the Tallinn ferry terminal, relatives waited. Some had come before dawn, after hearing rumors. Others arrived after morning broadcasts. They stood inside the terminal building, watching the television mounted in the corner. The volume was turned low. A few staff members moved between desks, answering phones, writing names. In Stockholm, families gathered at the S-Line office. Many had been expecting relatives that day, travelers returning from business, vacation, or school exchange. Some had driven to the port hours earlier. Others waited at home until they couldn't wait any longer. They called the ferry line. Most lines were busy. Some calls were never answered. By midday, the ferry was confirmed lost. The Swedish Prime Minister gave a short statement. The Estonian president followed. Flags were lowered. The number of survivors remained low. A list of the rescued, only first names at first, began to circulate through embassies and consulates. People called hospitals, border control offices, coast guards. They gave names and dates of birth. Some heard confirmation. Others waited. A crisis center was established in Stockholm. Inside a conference room converted for emergency use, printed passenger manifests were taped to the wall. Volunteers, many of them employees from S-Line, used pens to mark which names had been matched to survivors. They drew check marks beside some. Others remained blank. The unmarked names grew heavier with each hour that passed. By evening, the number of missing was no longer an estimate. It was a list. Families sat on plastic chairs, listening for news. Some stared at the same door for hours. Others cried quietly or held printed photographs. The atmosphere was restrained. The reality had not settled fully. But each hour without a name, each name not read aloud, made the picture clearer. The people who were missing were not numbers. They were students, grandparents, truck drivers, couples, children, newlyweds, entire families, groups of friends, people heading home, people heading to work, people who had chosen the overnight ferry to save time or money, people who had never set foot on a ship before. In hospitals in Turku and Helsinki, survivors were kept under observation. Many were treated for hypothermia, bruises, exhaustion. Some had fractured ribs or limbs from being thrown against the ship's interior. Others had no visible injuries but could not speak. Doctors asked questions gently. Some patients responded. Others looked away. Few remembered all the details. Most remembered only fragments, cold metal, a tilted floor, voices fading around them. The survivors' clothes were bagged and sealed. Personal belongings had been lost. Passports, wallets, shoes. One man was admitted wearing only a hospital blanket. Another arrived barefoot, still holding a seat cushion from the raft. Their names were matched with the manifest. Families were contacted. Some were still hoping their loved one might be among them. A few were. Most were not. In the days that followed, bodies were recovered from the sea. Some were brought to shore by Navy vessels. Others were found floating, still in life jackets, by fishing boats. The identification process was slow. Weather conditions remained difficult. Autopsies were conducted. DNA samples were taken when possible. Personal items were cataloged: rings, watches, bracelets, wallets swollen with water. News outlets released photographs of the search area. Maps showed the location where the Estonia had gone down, about 22 nautical miles south of the Finnish coast, in international waters. The press showed images of rescue helicopters, empty life rafts, and flowers being placed at ferry terminals. Public mourning began. In Estonia, a national day of mourning was declared. Churches opened their doors. Memorials were held in city squares and small villages. Photographs of the missing were placed near candles. In Sweden, vigils were held near the harbor. People stood in silence. Some wrote names on white paper and taped them to the terminal walls. The official death toll was eventually confirmed at 852. Of those, 757 were passengers. 95 were crew. Only 137 people survived. Most of the victims were Swedish. A significant number were Estonian. Others came from Finland, Latvia, Denmark, Germany, and a handful of other countries. The youngest passenger lost was 6 years old. The oldest was in their 80s. For many families, there was no funeral, only absence, only paperwork, a notification, a condolence letter, a meeting with embassy staff, a name on a list. For some, a body never found. For others, a sealed coffin, delivered with warning not to open it. The sea had taken more than people. It had taken time, last words, last gestures, the ordinary rituals that follow death. In the weeks ahead, the lists were finalized. Press briefings stopped, but the families remembered, and for each of them, the silence between the departure and the news that followed would remain as long as memory itself. In the days following the disaster, a joint official investigation was established. Sweden, Finland, and Estonia formed a commission known as the Joint Accident Investigation Commission, the JIC. Their task was to determine what had happened, how the vessel had failed, and whether anything could have prevented the loss. The MS Estonia was located quickly. It rested on the seabed of the Baltic Sea, about 80 meters deep, lying on its starboard side. Sonar confirmed its position. Remote camera footage showed damage at the bow. The ship was mostly intact, but visibly broken along the forward section. The decision was made not to enter the wreck. The governments of Sweden, Estonia, and Finland agreed that the site would be treated as a maritime grave. They passed legislation forbidding diving, salvage, or physical disturbance. For families, this was explained as a gesture of dignity and protection. For others, it created limits on the scope of investigation. Access to the interior of the ship would not take place. Instead, the inquiry used available data, design records, maintenance logs, inspection reports, survivor testimony, and digital simulations. Survivors were interviewed at length. Shipbuilders and crew were consulted. Meteorological reports were studied. The investigation relied on analysis rather than direct physical access. In 1997, the final report was published. Its conclusion was direct. The bow visor had failed. The report stated that under sustained wave impacts, the locking mechanisms of the visor had broken. The visor tore away from the hull, exposing the vehicle ramp behind it. That ramp was not designed to hold back direct seawater. It collapsed inward. Cold water rushed into the car deck, an open space with no watertight subdivisions. The ship quickly lost its stability. The list worsened. Within roughly half an hour, the Estonia sank. The report also cited several contributing factors. The bow design had structural weaknesses under repeated wave stress. The lack of watertight compartments on the car deck allowed flooding to spread without restriction. The vessel's freeboard, the height of the deck above water, was lower than ideal for storm conditions. Emergency systems did not function in time due to the speed of flooding and electrical failure. Evacuation equipment was inaccessible or inoperable once the ship began to list. The investigation also reviewed the rescue response. Helicopters had been delayed by geography, preparation time, and weather. Coordination between Finnish, Swedish, and Estonian agencies had been reactive rather than proactive. No other ships had been close enough to intervene quickly. Communication between the Estonia and rescue centers had been brief and fragmented. The report made formal recommendations. Ferry design standards were revised across Europe. Bow visors were reinforced. Safety drills and passenger briefings were updated. Radar, navigation, and distress systems were improved. International maritime regulations adopted changes in how ferries were inspected and maintained. But the investigation did not satisfy everyone. Some of the victims' families questioned the scope. They believed the refusal to enter the wreck had left too many unknowns. Others pointed to prior concerns raised about the Estonia's structural condition. A few survivors expressed frustration over unanswered procedural details, including why no general alarm had sounded and why lifeboats had not been reachable. No single alternative explanation was offered officially. The JIC stood by its findings. No foul play was suggested. No technical failure beyond the visor's detachment was confirmed. But the distance between what was known and what remained unseen meant that not all questions were addressed in full. The Estonia's wreck remained undisturbed. Later studies used updated sonar and external imaging, but the ship was not opened. Its position was marked. Its name was remembered, but the full interior was left to time. The investigation ended with recommendations. The changes it prompted became part of maritime policy. The story of the Estonia entered the records of European shipping history as both a tragedy and a structural case study. It was not closed emotionally, but it was concluded formally, and what had happened that night, on open water in darkness with little warning, was now part of how future ships would be understood, designed, and sailed. After the investigation ended and the headlines faded, life for the survivors and families of the victims continued in a different shape. Not returned to normal, just continued. Many of them spoke rarely about what had happened. Others shared their stories in interviews, in support groups, or with people they trusted. But most of the time, the memories remained quiet, folded into ordinary days. For those who had survived, returning home was not a resolution. Some faced physical injuries that healed slowly or never fully. Others struggled with sleep, with crowds, with the sound of heavy weather or loud mechanical noise. A few developed patterns of avoidance, routes they would no longer take, places they wouldn't visit. Certain smells brought them back to that night. The weight of wet clothing, the cold of wind through steel, the absence of direction. Not all carried visible grief. For some, the impact was quiet, a change in how they marked time, a calendar that never skipped past late September without a pause, a date that could not be ignored, no matter how much life had moved on. The families of those who were lost lived with a different silence. Some never received a body to bury. Others had funerals without remains. A few received sealed coffins, accompanied by official papers. In many cases, children grew up without one or both parents. Spouses remained without the chance to say goodbye. In Estonia, Sweden, and Finland, whole communities had been affected. Schools had lost students. Offices had lost colleagues. Villages had lost names they would never forget. Anniversaries became quiet rituals. Some chose to gather each year near the shoreline. They stood at ferry terminals or on rocky coasts, watching the water in stillness. Flowers were placed in the sea. Names were spoken out loud. Others stayed home. They lit a candle. They sat with old photographs. They didn't need public ceremonies to remember. For them, the memory had never left. In the years that followed, official monuments were placed in Tallinn, Stockholm, and other cities. They were not large or elaborate. Just stone, sometimes etched with names, sometimes not. They served as places to pause, to reflect, to remember those who had boarded a ship and did not return. Some of the survivors visited these places. Others did not. There was no single right way to remember. There was only the choice to carry it or to set it down for a while. Some of the relatives became involved in legal proceedings. They attended inquiries. They asked questions about safety, about regulation, about responsibility. Others chose not to take part, not out of acceptance, but because the process brought them little comfort. There was nothing they felt they could recover. The outcome would not change what had happened. Years passed. The Estonia remained underwater. Families remained above it. Children grew older. Some of them learned about the disaster later, from television or books, not from their own memories. They asked questions that their families answered in fragments. A few carried the story forward, in writing, in research, or in quiet testimony. Others carried it without words. There were no clear milestones after the 10th year. The world had changed in other ways. Ferry travel continued. The Baltic routes remained active. The Estonia became a reference point in maritime history, a case study in design, emergency response, and regulatory reform. But for those who had been closest to it, the memory was not technical. It was personal. It stayed beneath the surface of conversation, present but rarely detailed. Not everyone kept a public connection to the event. Many of the survivors lived out their lives without giving interviews, without joining groups, without marking the date on anything other than their own calendar. Some remained in the same cities. Others moved. Some returned to sea travel. Others never stepped on another ferry again. The Estonia had left no final chapter for them, only a space where time had been interrupted. And over the years, that space remained, not filled in, not erased, just carried quietly, like something learned once and never forgotten. The wreck of the MS Estonia still lies where it came to rest, just over 22 nautical miles off the coast of Finland, in the international waters of the Baltic Sea. The ship remains on its starboard side, at a depth of around 80 meters. The currents above it move constantly. The water is cold and dark. The hull has shifted slightly over time, but the ferry is still there. No recovery operation was ever attempted. The decision was made early. The wreck was declared a grave site, and all three countries involved, Estonia, Sweden, and Finland, signed a legal agreement prohibiting any diving, salvage, or interference. Additional laws were passed domestically to enforce that boundary. The site would remain untouched. What was there would stay there. In the years that followed, occasional expeditions approached the site with cameras. Some were official, organized under the supervision of state agencies. Others were conducted without authorization. Most used remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, to film the wreck from a distance. The bow was visibly damaged. The visor was gone, later recovered from the seafloor several hundred meters from the hull. The ramp beneath it was bent inward. The open car deck could not be entered directly. The footage confirmed the general conclusions of the official report, but also raised new questions, not of conspiracy but of detail. Minor inconsistencies in damage, unexplained openings along the hull, new sediment patterns. In response, Sweden commissioned further assessments. A new survey was conducted in 2021 using sonar, divers, and modern imaging. It did not change the official record, but it reopened interest briefly. For most people, the Estonia is no longer a current event. It belongs to a different decade, a different time in the Baltic region. It is taught in maritime safety courses. It appears in documentaries. It is cited in technical manuals. Ferry companies still refer to its lessons. International treaties on vessel stability, evacuation systems, and structural integrity were influenced by what happened that night. But those are professional memories. The personal ones are quieter. The commemorative sites remain. In Tallinn, a curved wall of names stands near the sea. In Stockholm, a similar memorial rests near Djurgården. Flowers are placed there each year. Small candles, sometimes with photographs, sometimes without. People pass in silence. Some stop for a few minutes. Others stay longer. The names are engraved, not grouped by age, or nationality or family, just listed, as they were, together. Not all families visit these places. Some prefer the private act of remembering, at home, in thought, with objects that were once owned by someone who never came back. A scarf, a boarding pass, a photograph taken at the terminal. Many of those things were never returned, but the memory attached to them didn't need to be complete to endure. The Estonia is not a shipwreck surrounded by myth. It is not a story that lends itself to closure. There was no war, no fire, no battle between people, just a vessel, a route, a storm, and a failure. The events that unfolded were mechanical, environmental, and human, and the outcome was fixed within a single hour, from routine to silence. But even now, decades later, the ferry remains a point of pause. The shape of it is rarely seen anymore. The footage, though available, is seldom broadcast. Most of the memory lives in stillness, in articles, in recollection, in the lived experience of those who were touched by it. Time did not settle the story. It only carried it further out. The MS Estonia has not returned to public attention in any final way. It does not resurface. It stays where it went down, in deep water, far from shore, below waves that have continued to rise and fall in the years since. No monument can explain what it meant to the people who were there, and no report can fully hold what was lost. But what remains is quiet and real and still present, not in the surface of the sea but below it, and in the lives that never fully moved on, even as the world around them did.